almost just as well. So we're going to talk tonight about home composting to manage yard and kitchen waste. And I'm going to, let's see, got to share my screen here. And then we'll get started. All right, home composting to manage kitchen and yard waste. Okay, we're going to be doing a couple, come on back here. Where do we go? We're going to be doing a couple of things. We're going to look first at ways to reduce kitchen and yard waste, even before we even start to think about composting. Because we can generate, if you're like me, I have a couple trees in my yard and I have neighbors that have a lot of trees, and that can generate a lot of leaves in the fall. So we're going to look at some things on ways to reduce some of your yard waste before we even start about composting. Then we're going to look at how composting can further reduce the waste that's generated in our households. We're going to talk about traditional composting using piles or bins, and this is usually used outdoors. And then I have a section at the end called vermicomposting, which uses worms for composting indoors. And this can be done even by people who live in apartments. So if you have kitchen waste, you might not have yard waste, but you do have kitchen waste that you're generating, you can still do composting. Why do we want to compost? Wisconsin generates 500,000 tons of compostable materials, including food scraps each year that could be composted and made into useful products. 35.6% of that waste went to landfills last year. This is according to a study that was done last year by the DNR. They went through the waste at 14 landfills, I believe, and separated it out. I don't know, that was a good job. And to figure out what was being sent to landfills. And now think of the resources that we use to grow, harvest, and transport all that food that we now are throwing away. There are 200 state licensed composting facilities in Wisconsin that manage something like 200,000 tons of yard waste materials a year. We're not talking about pounds, we're talking about tons. Municipal composting requires transporting the yard waste, which uses fuel, manpower, and time to move tons of yard waste from homes and compost areas by citizens or municipal workers, depending on your locale. Homeowners spend a lot of money each year to buy and transport compost, fertilizers, and mulch, also to enrich their yards and gardens. That all sounds like a lot of hours, money, and resources wasted if we can somehow get those two connected. As I talked about, 30% of the landfill contents is organic matter, and that's mostly food that was thrown away and other plant source materials. Second was paper, including paper and cardboard, and those also can be composted, as well as being recycled. This organic matter produces methane gas in landfills. And this is the kicker. This is why it's so important to try to keep those out of landfills. Methane is a greenhouse gas that is 28 times more powerful than carbon dioxide at trapping heat in the atmosphere. Let's see. I remember, okay. Methane in landfills is hard to capture, so it escapes to contribute dangerously to climate warming. And again, this sounds like a lot of things accounting for our environmental disaster. So there's some benefits of reducing wasted food. First of all, it saves you money because you're buying less food. If you use all of the food you buy, you have to buy less. It reduces the methane emissions from landfills and lowers your carbon footprint. It conserves energy and resources, preventing pollution involved in the growing, manufacturing, transporting, and selling of food, not to mention hauling the food waste away and then landfilling it. And it also supports your community by providing untouched food that would have gone otherwise to waste to those who might not have a steady food supply. So if we waste that much food every year, someone else is not able to use it. What are some ways we can reduce food waste? These are some tips that I came across from the EPA website article on reducing food wasted at home. By simply making a weekly list with meals in mind, you can save a lot of money, time, and also eat healthier food. If you buy no more than what you expect to use, you will be more likely to keep it fresh and use it all. Keep a running list of meals and their ingredients that your household readily enjoys. And that way you have an easy way to shop for and prepare meals. Think ahead to the week coming up when you go do your shopping. Will you be eating out? How often? How many meals will you eat at home? Do you plan to have guests? And plan your meals before you go shopping. Also note the quantity you want on your shopping list so that you avoid overbuying. Look in your refrigerator and your cupboards first to avoid buying food that you already have. And make a list each week what needs to be used up. Put those leftovers in transparent containers and keep them towards the front of the shelf that you remember, okay, I have some of this that I can use up some way this week in my cooking. And buy only what you need and use. A lot of people think that buying in bulk saves money, but if you only use half of it and throw half of it away, it's not a good deal anymore. Some tips for storing foods to keep it from spoiling. Don't overbuy and then forget about fresh fruits and vegetables. Store those properly in the refrigerator for most of them. They'll taste better and last longer. There are definite places that are better to store different fruits and vegetables in your refrigerator. Sometimes they're best stored outside the refrigerator, like onions, garlic, and potatoes. Tomatoes are another one. If you have the opportunity, freeze, preserve, or can some of the surplus things that you have. This is especially important during the season we just finished now, where people had a lot of garden produce, and rather than letting that go to waste, share it or freeze it some way so that it can be used later. Many fruits give off a natural gas as they ripen, and that may make other foods stored nearby spoil faster. So things like bananas, apples, and tomatoes should be stored kind of by themselves, and store fruits and vegetables in a different bin in your refrigerator. Berries should not be washed until you are ready to eat them because if they're wet, they mold very easily. And if you like to eat fruit at room temperature, take it out the day before so that it's at the temperature that you want to eat it. Some preparation tips. Use your perishable foods first after you do shopping. It'll be easier to whip up meals or snacks. If you bring it home and you take the time to wash it, with the exception of berries, and dry it, chop it, dice it, or whatever you're going to do with it for the cooking you're going to do this week, and then put it in the refrigerator, it's there for people to snack on, so that at the end of the week, you don't say, oh, I found this head of lettuce that I forgot I was going to use, and now it's spoiled. Think about the freezer too. Many foods can be frozen until you are ready to use them. And also think of in terms of preparing and freezing a whole meal so that the food that you bought is used right away and not wasted. And then prepare and cook perishable items and then freeze them. For example, bake and freeze chicken breasts or fry and freeze taco meat. And that way you'll have those things ready for quick meals. And some thriftiness tips. Be mindful of old ingredients and leftovers. Shop your refrigerator first. If you have produce that's not quite, A1 shape, think about how that can be used. Many times it can be used in soups, casseroles, stir fries, sauces, baked into things, put into pancakes or smoothies. These are all ways to use fruits and vegetables that might not be at their best for eating right out of hand, but they are perfectly good yet for other uses. If it's safe and healthy, eat the edible parts of the food that you don't usually eat. Like you don't have to peel potatoes necessarily before you eat them. Stale bread can be made into croutons. The tops of some vegetables can be used to for stock or to put into side dishes. And here's a big one. This one is something that causes people to throw more food away probably than anything else. The sell by, use by, best bet by, and expiration dates on food. Actually, all of these terms are technically not required by food companies at all. The only thing that has to be dated for an expiration date is infant formula. So what they mean, sell by, if you see sell by and then a date, it means that you want to buy that food by that date. It doesn't mean that it's bad at that date. It just means the grocer should have it sold to someone by that date. Use by and best by kind of mean the same thing. And it refers more to quality, that the manufacturers thinks that the food will taste best and be in its best form before the date on that package. That does not mean that the food is inedible after that date. So it's perfectly good to use food that's beyond its expiration date as long as it smells, tastes, looks okay. Obviously, you wouldn't use moldy food. Many canned foods in cans and jars are, if they're stored in a cool place, are good for a long time after their expiration date. And like I said, the only hard and fast expiration date for food is infant formula. How about having a leftovers night for dinner some night? Everyone probably has a favorite something in that refrigerator that's left over that they would enjoy eating again. And so you will have something for everybody that night, and you don't have to worry about finicky eaters and that sort of thing. We talked earlier about using leftovers to remake into another dish. For example, leftover vegetables to put into frittatas and soups, leftover fruits to put into smoothies, leftover meats and vegetables to put into casseroles. There's tons of recipes that we can use to save that food. And at restaurants, when you're ordering out, only order what you can finish by asking about portion sizes and being aware of the side dishes that are included with entrees. And if you can, take home the leftovers and use them again for another meal. And when you're eating at an all-you-can-eat buffet, take only what you can eat. Restaurants also throw away huge quantities of food that are merely wasted because people order more than they can eat, or they take more than they can eat on their plates. So let's talk a little bit about reducing some yard waste. One of the big yard waste things that occur a lot is grass clippings. You can leave the grass clippings on the lawn rather than bagging them. And that's one way that we can drastically reduce a lot of yard waste. Grass clippings left on the lawn are not harmful to the turf if it's mowed at the proper height and frequency, which means that it's kept at about 3 inches tall and you mow about 1/3 whenever you mow. As long as the grass can be seen underneath the clippings. So in other words, you don't let your lawn get so long that you can't see the grass anymore before you mow. Those grass clippings can be left there. It will likely mean that you may have to mow a little more often, but you also don't have to deal with any of the clippings. The clippings are actually good for your lawn. They can reduce fertilizer requirements by 1/2. So if you're in the habit of fertilizing your lawn, you may be able to get away with not fertilizing it if you only fertilize, let's say, once a year. And if you do multiple fertilizings, it's good for at least one fertilizing application a year. And also grass clippings do not contribute to thatch buildup because they actually break down quite readily. Thatch is composed of dead and decomposing roots and underground stems. And that's usually caused by over-fertilizing and over-watering, not by leaving the grass clippings on the lawn. Also, mowing when it's dry prevents the clippings from matting down. If it is excessively tall when you mow, and like I said, you can't see the grass too well in places, you might have to then rake that, but that can be added to a compost pile or used as mulch in a garden or flower bed, except if you've treated your lawn with chemicals. Leaves are another huge source of yard waste. They are an excellent mulch. They're a little bit coarse and tend to mat down if you use the whole leaves, but you can run your lawnmower over piles of leaves and use the shredded leaves to mulch plants over the winter, or you can use it to mulch vegetables and garden beds in the summer. You can also use them to protect roses and other plants, perennials over the winter. Shredded leaves can be lightly dug into flower and vegetable gardens as a soil conditioner and fertilizer. You can leave them on the lawn, providing you don't have massive amounts of leaves. And as you mow, you will chop up the leaves, and as long as you can see the grass blades again after you mow, you can leave them right on your lawn. And again, they add more organic matter and nutrients back into the lawn. And if you have shade gardens underneath those trees, leaves can be left right on the gardens. You don't have to rake them off. Most shade plants, especially natives, don't mind being covered with leaves at all because that's what they do in nature. You can remove them in the spring if you want to, but it's not going to usually harm the plants during the winter unless you leave them too thick and they start to mat down. You could also rake leaves and leave them under the perimeter plantings of shrubs. Just tuck them under those evergreens and things instead of having to haul them away. In your garden and flower beds, some ways to reduce waste. Many perennials don't need to be cut back in the fall. If you leave them to decompose over the winter, the mass will be total mass will be much smaller if you decide to remove it in the spring. It can also be just left as mulch, and leaving those plant stems and things in place over winter helps to protect the plant from frost heave and that sort of thing. You can turn under the debris in the spring or the fall, and that allows it to compost for following year's crops. If you choose plants and shrubs and trees in an appropriate size for your lot, you don't have to do a lot of pruning, and you will create less yard waste. Native plants will usually take care of themselves and require very little water or fertilizer if the dead parts are allowed to compost in place. Over-fertilizing, which leads to excessive growth and therefore more debris, it also washes into gutters and streams and waterways. So over-fertilizing will also create more yard waste. And one of the things you can do is pull weeds when they're small before they flower. And when they're that small, they're not a danger, just to leave where they are in place and let them decompose right there. So what is compost, or what is composting? After you've thought about all the ways you might be able to reduce the waste you have, what's left, you might decide to compost. And actually what composting is, as a verb, it refers to the process of turning organic waste into valuable soil amendments. And it allows the organic matter to decompose and fix the nitrogen into a stable form that can be used by plants. Contrast that to what we talked about earlier, where if you end up landfilling these types of materials, it releases undesirable gases, contributes to carbon warming, and actually releases more carbon into the atmosphere rather than sequestering it or holding it in place. Compost, the noun, refers to that dark, earthy smelling, decomposed organic matter that is highly sought after as a soil amendment. Whenever we talk about amending soil, making soil better for plants growing, we say add compost. Well, where do you get that compost? So all you need is 4 basic ingredients. You need some brown materials, some green materials, some water, and some air. And you might also want to add a little bit of soil or already finished compost to your pile. And that contains those little microorganisms that are going to do the magic of turning that brown and green stuff into compost. What's the value of compost? We use it as a soil conditioner to improve especially clay or sandy soils. If you add it to clay soil, it loosens the clay soil so that the water can penetrate better and the roots can penetrate better. And it allows more air into the soil. When you have heavy soil like clay, it's very dense. It also can reduce soil crusting so that after a rain, there's not that stiff surface on the ground, so plants can grow better. In sandy soil, which does not hold water very well or nutrients, compost, when you add that, will help to hold that water and nutrients for the plants so they can use that better rather than just having the water and the nutrients wash away. It can add nutrients to the soil in a form that's readily available to plants. It's not the chemical form that you use when you use Miracle Grow or Schultz's plant food or those other things. And it adds organic matter to poor soils also. Organic matter is an important component of soil, and that's what helps to hold the moisture and things into the soil. It holds water in the soil, helps it to stay there rather than running off and going someplace where it's really not needed. You can also add soil microorganisms to improve plant growth, and you can use it as a mulch too. That can be put on the ground around plants, and as the season goes on, it will gradually be worked into the soil around the plant. And so when you're doing composting in a compost pile, I'm not talking about the worm thing now, there's actually 2 different ways to compost. We call it the cold way, or some people say it's the lazy way or the laid back way or slow composting. And then we have hot or active or fast composting. And really the difference is how much work you want to put in to maintaining your compost pile. So a cold method is you just add the organic matter, it becomes available. You water it occasionally to keep that water, that compost moist enough. And then over the course of about 2 years or so, you can probably start taking stuff from the bottom of the pile and continue adding to the top. And so it's a very laid back, as we call it, way of composting. However, it takes quite a while for you to get finished compost. The hot or active or fast composting, you use a little bit more care in balancing the browns and the greens you put into the compost pile. It's watered regularly and it's turned, and this is where the work comes in. Turn the compost pile or stir it or aerate it every week or 2. And you want to keep this pile that you're working on separate from the things you're putting in a new compost pile, because you want all of these parts of the active pile to break down before you're adding new things to it. And then you harvest the finished compost each year. You can harvest it if you're really an active composter in anywhere from, I've heard, 6 to 8 weeks to maybe 3 to 4 months. So you might be able to get a batch of compost this growing season and then have another one well on its way to next growing season. So what do you need for composting? You have to pick a site, and we'll talk about that in a minute. A possible container, you can do it without a container of some kind, but we'll talk about that too. You need greens. These are nitrogen-rich materials. browns, which are carbon-rich materials, a source of water. You're going to probably need a fork or a shovel, some muscle if you want to do the faster composting, and some time. So where would you want to build your compost pile? Okay, you want it in a convenient but an inconspicuous place. If the compost will be used mainly in the garden and most of the materials you're using to put into your compost pile are coming from the garden, then a location near the garden would be logical. You also want it to be convenient to a source of water because it's going to have to be kept moist during dry weather. But you don't also want to locate the pile where water may stand because excess moisture on the bottom can cause the whole process to stop and may lead to odor problems and a kind of a stinky compost pile. You want to also locate the pile where the earthy odors are not likely to offend neighbors. You probably don't want to put it in your front yard. If you have a corner of a yard somewhere or behind or beside a building, maybe. People also are pretty creative in how they dress up their compost pile or hide it by planting things around the compost pile, like flowers and vines and things. So it does not necessarily have to be an eyesore. A shaded area is generally desirable too if you have it, if possible, but don't locate it too close to trees. Tree roots sometimes grow into the compost pile because they like that good organic matter, and it may make it hard to turn the compost pile and hard to get it out later. Maples are pretty good at doing this. Oaks and pines have a not so aggressive root system. Oaks are a deeper root system. I had mine for many years underneath some pine trees, which was nice because it was in the shade. It was nice and cool when I had to go turn it. And I really didn't have a bother with the roots falling in it, but I had a lot of pine cones in my compost. So you just kind of have to, you know, figure out where's the best way to find a place that's pretty convenient, but yet not real conspicuous. You also want to stay at least 3 feet from a building so that it gets the rain coming into it and it's not too tight under the leaves or too tight against the house where it could cause like mold and things to grow. So containing your compost, what can you use to keep it in a pile? You don't have to use anything. However, if you don't, the pile will take up more space, and it also probably won't look as neat. It's also better if it's kind of in a compact area so that it allows the heat to build up. You want to have a lot of heat in your compost pile. So people have used things like you can see in the pictures on the bottom here, a wire ring, and then you might want to cover the sides to keep the material in there with like a landscape fabric that breathes, or a screen, a finer screen, something like that. You can also build one out of cement blocks, wood slats, but you want the size to be at least 3 feet by 3 feet and probably not more than 4 feet by 4 feet because it gets a little bit unwieldy. Here are some bin ideas that pictures that I took off the internet. And the top left ones are commercial bins that you can buy. I tried the one that looks like a barrel on the supported on a rack there. It didn't work well for me. You can't keep adding to it. So you almost have to have another place to start another pile or someplace. And it just kind of developed into big clumps inside there, even though I turned it every day. The black one next to it is probably best used for a lazy composter who doesn't have too much stuff to put in the composter. It usually has a door on the bottom, like you can see in the front there, where you can access the finished compost on the bottom. But for the most part, these purchased ones are pretty small to do really good composting. In the middle on the top, you see one built from pallets, and that's an okay thing to do. We have a wire mesh one in the upper right corner. You can actually use a garbage can with holes in it. It's a little bit hard to, again, mix this compost. If you use cement blocks, be sure to leave a little space between the blocks. Don't stack them tight together, or you're not going to allow enough air to get into the compost bin. There's a reference on the sheet that has a whole bunch of different ideas on ways you can make your own compost bin. And also, if you just Google compost bins and look at images, you can get a lot of ideas also. And you might be able to use some materials that you already have at home. Having one side that can be opened or removed makes it easier to access the compost, to turn it, and to remove it later. So you might think of that too as having that, at least that one side that you can remove. You can do it, like I said, in composting in heaps or piles. Minimum size for that would be about 5 feet by 5 feet by 3 feet high. You just add materials on the top, and then when you get to that size, you have to start another pile. And as you can see on the right-hand side there, you would start from the bottom and pull it up from the bottom, and there'll be stuff on top that's not composted yet. It's kind of hard to have an active compost pile when you have just a pile and it's not a bin where you can actually turn it. If you're going to make a bin, I would make two, so that you could, 2 or even 3, so that you could turn material from one into another bin, and then you keep the third bin for accumulating material for next year's compost. That works pretty good, and you have kind of a system going then. So what are greens and browns? We talked about adding greens and browns. Green materials are generally fresh plants that are growing, that are not wilted. It can be thatch from lawns if you dethatch your lawn. It can be grass clippings. You want to put those in a thin layer though, so that they don't clump together and get moldy. Vegetable peels, fruits, other fruit waste, but take the stickers off because they don't break down in a compost pile. You can add manure from only plant-eating animals. So that would be rabbits and chickens. You can't put in pet waste or any of the animals that eat meat. So you would not want to put in, like I say, your pet waste. You would not want to put in pig manure, probably, depending what you feed your pig. Horse and cow manure, they're herbivores, so those would be okay. And also coffee grounds and tea bags count as greens, even though they aren't green, they're more brown. Brown materials generally are dead or dried, and that could be weeds, leaves, brush that you've clipped off, eggshells, sawdust, wood chips, straw, hair from pets or humans, grain and grain products like bread and rice and pasta, things like that, that you could put in there. If you put ash in, wood ash, don't ever use coal ash because that has other minerals in it, but wood ash, you want to use that very sparingly because that changes the pH of the pile. You probably do not want to put in weeds that have gone to seed or that have seed heads on them unless you're doing a really hot compost pile. So that's important to know, because otherwise those weed seeds will go right through your compost pile, and when you put it back on your garden, they'll grow again. So how do you build the compost pile? So you'll need greens and browns. Start with a layer of browns in a ratio of about 2 parts of brown to 1 part of greens. You put the greens in a second layer on top. You can add a shovel full of garden soil or finished compost or manure, and then mix that with a shovel or a fork and water that layer well. And then you keep repeating those layers until you've used all the materials you have on hand. If you are short of greens, you can add a little diluted high nitrogen fertilizer, such as a high nitrogen lawn fertilizer. It's better to use the kind that you would mix with water, not the little pellets that you put on your lawn. Blood meal is also a very high nitrogen source, so you could add a little bit of that. If you are short of browns, you can always use shredded newspaper, torn up paper egg cartons, shredded cardboard. All those things will work as browns. So that's how you build your compost pile. Cold composting, cool composting, laid back composting. After that, you just water the pile if the weather is dry, and you just let it be and wait for it to do its thing. Hot composting, you'll want to turn or move the compost every week or two for faster decomposition. The turning introduces more air, and it can kind of get matted down by the weight of the pile. And so when you turn it, you're loosening that material inside the pile, and you allow more air to get in. Also, if you turn it, you're moving the material from the inner part of the pile where it's hot and it's working really well to the outside, and the outside stuff back to the inside, and kind of mixing it together. A hot compost pile can reach 130 to 140 degrees, and that greatly accelerates turning those raw materials into compost. You can also turn it whenever you feel like doing it too. Like I said, the more you turn it, it can be ready in as little as 8 weeks. Well, if you don't turn it at all, it could take up to 2 years. So the more you turn the pile, the faster it's going to decompose. So how does that become compost? When the mixture of browns and greens gets together, and those little soil organisms from the soil or the compost you added or the manure, those little soil organisms start to work on breaking down that organic matter. They literally digest it, and they need water and air just like people do in order to do their job. And the compost pile, if it's built correctly, will heat up at the beginning when you first start it, and it can get quite warm. If it gets more than 160 degrees, you may end up having inferior compost because it actually starts to cook the little organisms in there. And that heating phase lasts for a couple of turns, or if you're doing a cold composting, it can last quite a while. And then it goes into a curing phase. That doesn't produce as much heat, and the compost is gradually more finely digested by these little organisms. It turns into that nice brown stuff that we like to put on our gardens. You need to water it enough so that the compost materials have a consistency of a well wrung out sponge at all times. The edges of the compost pile will probably dry out more than the middle, so you might want to concentrate a little more on wetting the edges. You can cover the compost pile with a breathable material if you find it's attracting animals or insects. But generally, a well-built compost pile will not have problems with either one of those. I used to cover mine to keep the pine cones from falling in and the pine branches, because they don't break down nearly as fast as the rest of the compost materials. I was always screening those out, but it doesn't have to be necessarily covered. The smaller the pieces also that you put in there, the faster the compost works. So if you break down the material that you're putting in, into fist-sized pieces, that shredding or tearing or chipping of woody materials helps it to break down much faster. What can and cannot be composted. So we talked about a lot of the things in the green column there that can be composted. It's probably a lot more than we probably think of sometimes as what we can compost and when we can't. There are some definite things, though, that should not be added to compost piles, and these will cause problems, either with you or your neighbors or your compost. The black walnut trees, any part of the trees, the leaves, the twigs, will contain a substance called juglone. And this is a chemical that inhibits the growth of many plants. Tomatoes are particularly susceptible to this. So if you put that in your compost pile, it doesn't break down in the compost pile. When you spread the compost on your vegetable or flower beds, it's going to inhibit the growth of some of the plants. There are a few plants that don't mind it, but by far, most plants do not get along well with juglone. You don't want to put in coal or charcoal ash because these can contain substances that are not contained in wood ash. Could be other chemicals, minerals, things that we don't want in there. Dairy products and eggs, these will create pest problems sometimes, rodents and flies and that. They also can create an odor problem because they decompose in a much smellier way. You don't want to put in very diseased or insect-ridden plants and unless you have a really hot compost pile. So if you're doing it the slow way, those disease things can sometimes last out the composting process and still end up going back to your garden beds again. Fats, grease, and oils, again, these will attract rodents and other things. Meat and fish bones, again, for the same reason, odor problem. Meat and fish bones, especially meat bones, meat and bones, well, bones take a long time to break down, but the meat, again, we talked earlier about omnivores and carnivores. They have very similar systems to humans. And so some of the diseases that come from these animals can be left in the compost pile, and you don't want to put that back on your gardens again. Same thing for pet feces and kitty litter. You don't want to put those in there either because they have parasites and bacteria and germs and things that people can get. And the last thing, don't put any yard trimmings that have been treated with chemical pesticides or herbicides. It's probably okay to put grass clippings in after it's been mowed at least 3 times and rained on a couple times. But generally speaking, those chemicals, some of them do break down, but some of them don't. And so you don't want to put those in your compost pile. Additional things not to compost. Brian Huddleston gave a program recently. These are diseases that can stay alive, I guess you would call it, in your compost pile from one year to the other. And so if you know that your plants have any one of these diseases, you would probably not want to compost that. Impatiens downy mildew was very prevalent a few years ago in our area, and it still is. If in fact, if you've planted regular impatiens, not the New Guinea impatiens, but regular ones, and had the downy mildew, you shouldn't plant those impatiens again in that spot. Late blight, we're always concerned about in Wisconsin because we grow so many potatoes. That's a very tricky organism. If there's any organic matter in there that does not thoroughly freeze or rot, that microorganism that causes a late blight can actually be transferred back to your garden again the next year. Boxwood blight is another one, tobacco mosaic virus, and many of these infect more than one plant too. Fire blight is common on trees. Verticillium is common to all kinds of plants and flowers and things. Again, you wouldn't want to plant things in that spot where you had verticillium for several years. Crown gall, Ralstonia wilt is particular mostly to geraniums in our area, but it can attack other things. And anything that died by sudden oak death. So if you have an unusual problem on a plant, it's probably a good idea to find out what it is so that you don't compost something that could lead to many more problems in the years to come. If you have some possible problems with your compost pile, here are some solutions. If you notice a bad odor coming from your pile, kind of an ammonia smell maybe, or just kind of a stinky smell, the pile could be too wet or it could be too tight. In other words, not enough air is getting into it, or both. So the solution to that is to turn it, to loosen the materials in it and allow the better air exchange into the pile. And if the pile, let's say we had just a horrendous amount of rain and your pile is really wet, just add new dry or brown materials to it as you turn it. Odors also come from animal products in the pile too. So that's why we don't put them in there. If nothing seems to be happening in your compost pile, it's probably too dry. So moisten the materials while turning the pile. Don't just dump a bunch of water on it, but turn it, stir it a little bit and add water to it. If the compost is moist enough and the center is a little warm, but not hot enough for complete breakdown, it's probably too small. And if it's the right size, you may need then more nitrogen. So you add one of those high nitrogen things like the dissolvable lawn fertilizer or blood meal. You can make the pile bigger, of course, and that will help, and turn in and mix old ingredients with new ingredients so that the partially decomposed stuff will get into the new stuff much easier. If the compost is moist and sweet smelling with some decomposition, but still doesn't heat enough, there's probably not enough nitrogen available. So add some more nitrogen. Some people in the past have said you need to add lime to compost piles. Don't add lime. It reduces the microbe activity and it also decreases the nutrient value of the compost when it's finished. So how do you know when it's done? Okay, how do I know when my compost is done cooking? It will look very much like soil. You will see really no recognizable plant parts anymore. As you can see in this picture, it kind of looks like very fine, loose, fluffy soil, and it will be a dark brown color. It crumbles easily, and it'll have a sweet, earthy smell. You will find that some plant material, when you think your compost is mostly done, is not done in there. You may find pieces of bark, or you may find twigs. You may find parts of plants that were especially tough when you put them in there. I know stems of my milkweed sometimes take more than a year. Definitely things like pine cones will take more than a year to decompose. So when you're going to use the compost, if you have a screen, about a 1/2-inch screen, and just sift the compost through that screen, that removes those unfinished pieces, and you can just toss those back into the working pile you have going at the time. Larger pieces of material, corn cobs and things, may need a second cycle to decompose completely. And then how do I use that compost? As we said before, compost is something that gardeners are always looking to get to add to your garden. Every time somebody says you have a problem with something, you say, well, add some compost. And so it can be used in garden beds. You spread an inch or two layer on top and till it into about the top 6 to 8 inches of soil. You can spread a ½ an inch on lawns and rake it down into the turf. This really helps to cut down on thatch buildup. It's quite a job if you have a big lawn, but if you have a small lawn, it's a way to use it. You can add it to container plantings when you do vegetables or flowers in containers. You can use it as a mulch on top of the soil in garden beds too. And it can be added to germination and potting mixes in place of peat moss. Peat moss is a non-renewable resource for the most part. And so if we can avoid using so much peat, that will also help our environment. When you use it in this way though, you would probably want to let it age down a little bit more to be sure that all the microorganisms have died off before you use it. So at that point, we're going to go to talk about vermicomposting. And this is for people who do not have a yard, but do have kitchen scraps, and it's called vermicomposting or worm composting. And it's a good idea to get rid of kitchen scraps without having to send it through the landfill or to run it through your garbage disposal. What you need is a container with a cover that is not airtight. You don't want it to be really tight, because remember, these little worms are living beings, so they need water and air and all that kind of stuff, just like people do. So some suggestions, pictures you can see there on the right-hand side. You can build one out of wood. Wood is heavier, and but it could be set outside if you had room to do that. You can use plastic bins. As you see in the picture there, the one that's tilted up, you need to put holes in the bottom of it. You can get ready-made worm composting systems, like you see in the picture there, which if you don't want to bother with making or building your own, that's one way to do it. You will need some bedding, a small amount of soil or grit for the worms, some water, some red wiggler worms, and a place to keep the container that's between 55 and 77 degrees. So some people use more than one container, smaller ones, so you can tuck it into a closet or underneath a kitchen sink, or underneath a desk, let's say, if you you have limited living space. Wood containers breathe a little bit better. The container only needs to be 8 to 12 inches high, because the worms feed near the surface. If you have too deep of a container, it can become an odor problem because it stays too wet. The size of the container you're going to use is determined by the amount of food scraps you generate. There's a book on the resource list called Worms Eat My Garbage that gives you a way to weigh your household food waste, and then figure out how big a compost bin you need for the worms. Bedding is, you can buy commercial bedding, but it's something that needs to be able to retain moisture and also provide airspace. This is where the worms are going to live. Shredded corrugated cardboard is excellent, but it's difficult to find unless you have a way to shred it yourself. Shredded newspaper or computer paper dries out a little faster than corrugated cardboard, and there's no problem with ink on the newspaper or the printer paper. That's not a problem for the worms. Peat moss can be used. It has a low pH though, and again, we said peat moss is kind of really when you think of it, a scarce commodity, because it's not readily replaceable. So probably your best bet is that shredded paper. You can also get, like I said, commercial worm bedding. So what you'll need is enough to about 2/3 full of your bin with this shredded newspaper. It needs to have needs to be wetted down and then wrung out well and fluffed up. So you're going to have fluffy newspaper that you're going to put your worms in. You need a little bit of soil or grit, and that can be something like cornmeal, coffee grounds, or finely crushed eggshells. You dry the eggshells and then crush them, because worms have a gizzard like a chicken or a bird, and so they need some grit to use to when they eat, and then the water to moisten the paper and to keep the bed moist. A particular red worm called a red wiggler worm is what you are used for composting. Earthworms need much more space than a bin to survive in, and also much cooler temperatures than the red wiggler worms. And they'll die in a bin, so don't even try it. Red worms, like I said here, prefer 55 to 77 degrees. Never let the bin freeze or get above 84 degrees though. Worm bins can be placed outside if the temperatures are suitable. Obviously, in a heat wave or when the weather gets cold, it's not suitable. Where can you find the worms? You can order them through lawn and garden catalogs. They might come as cocoons, which are little tiny worm eggs. There are also commercial websites where you can order them. You may be able to find them at a bait store, but be certain that you're getting the right worm. And very often people who have worm composting bins will be able to give you or sell you some, because the worms do reproduce, and once you start them, they do multiply. So how do you do this? You prepare the bin. 1 foot by 2 foot by 3 foot bin will take care of food scraps for a family of 4 generally. You drill holes in the bottom for aeration and drainage. Plastic bin will need more of those holes than a wooden bin. And then you put that bin on several bricks or wooden blocks and put a tray underneath it to capture any excess liquid. And that liquid can be used as fertilizer for plants. It can be house plants or outside plants. The bin will need a cover to conserve moisture, and the worms do not like light. So you definitely need a cover, but you don't want the cover to be airtight. If the bin is indoors, a dark sheet of plastic or a burlap sack, or putting it in a closet and closing the door will be dark enough. If you're putting it in an outdoor bin, then you definitely need a solid cover to keep out scavengers and keep out the rain and those kinds of things. So ventilation is important, and you don't want it to get too wet either. Well, you need to moisten the bedding with water and place that in a container. Allow the bedding to absorb as much water as possible before putting in the worm bin, and then squeezing it out really, really well so that it's kind of like just a well wrung out sponge. And then you need to fluff it. Then you sprinkle in some of your grit and you put your worms on it, on top of it. A pound of worms will take care of about a ½ pound of scraps a week. When you start adding the scraps, it's important to start slowly. As you build up the number of worms, you can add more scraps, but put them generally, a lot of people have kind of a system. They start in one corner and then they move over in the middle and put the food in the next time, and they move over to the next corner the next time. If you put in too much too fast, you're going to have a kind of a smelly worm bin. Don't worry about them starving if you don't put in enough, because they'll also be eating the bedding too. Smaller pieces will be easier for them to eat. So, by peelings are much easier than if you have a chunk of food, for example. Worms take a long time to digest citrus rinds and citrus fruits. So that's one thing that, maybe is not a good thing to put in the worm composting pile. You can also just spread the scraps in a thin layer on top of the bedding if you want to too. If it's kept in a dark place, the worms will come up and eat it. Some people just like to maybe cover it with a little bit of the bedding so that it's in the bedding and not visible and not, won't start rotting or something on top of the soil. Let's see. Cut back on food if, like I said, if you put too much in there at first, it may start to rot before the worms eat it. Garlic and onion skins are other things that they really have kind of a hard time chewing through. Let's see. They like probably leafy vegetables more than, especially citrus fruits. But vegetable peels, all vegetables and food peels you can use. Don't be surprised if potato peels might sprout in your worm bin. That's fine. You can also put in things like leftover pasta, coffee grounds, even the filter. If they're paper tea bags, some of the tea bags now are not paper, but if paper tea bags, that can go in there. And it's just like your compost pile outside. You don't want to put in meat, dairy, fats, and bones and that sort of thing. Some people say you could put in a little meat or protein for the worms, but that's really not necessary for most of the worms. Oops, I think I went one too many here. Let me back up. Okay, nope, maybe not. Okay, eventually you are going to have to harvest the worm castings. And it's just a nice way of saying the worm poop or the worm, after they've digested the food, what's left is the castings. So you will find that a lot of the bedding will be gone after 3 to 4 months, and you need to renew the bedding and harvest the castings or the worm compost. There are several ways to do this. Because worms don't like light, you can shine a bright light into the bin and the worms will move down into the lower layers and you can pick off or remove the top layer. That's one way you can do that. Because the worms, as you remove some, they'll keep going down, 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 down. Another method of harvesting the compost, which is probably works a little bit better and it's less time consuming, is to push all of the composted material to one side and put new bedding in the other side and new kitchen scraps, and then wait a few days. The worms will migrate from the old bedding into the new fresh stuff, and then you can just take out the stuff that's finished on the first side of the bed. If you pick out any worms or worm eggs, you can simply return them back to the bin. And using worm castings, it's just like using compost. It's a natural fertilizer and soil amendment. You can use it. In fact, it's better than ordinary soil. If you were to just pick up, a cup of ordinary soil and a cup of worm castings, the castings have 5 times more nitrogen, 7 times more phosphorus, and 11 times more potassium. They have humic acids, and they are improving the structure of the soil like compost you would make outside. If you're not going to use them right away, you might want to dry them to store them for when you need them. And you can use them in containers, garden beds, potted plants, put on top of the layer of potting soil as a mulch kind of thing. Just like you would use other compost. It's very mild compost. You don't have to worry about burning plants from either compost from a compost pile or the vermicomposting. Some things not to do with the worm composting. Don't put in plastic bottle caps. These are kind of like, obvious things, but sometimes they get in there. Don't let your cat use your worm bin as a litter box. The cat urine probably would make the odor intolerable, and it would kill your worms. And then there's also the concern with toxoplasmosis, which is a pathogen that is of particular concern to pregnant women who can pass that disease on to their unborn kids. So if you've ever been pregnant, you've probably been warned about that if you have a cat. So put a screen or definitely a cover that's going to stay on so the cat can't get into it. Don't use insecticides around your worm bin. You'll not only take care of the pests, but also your worms. Don't use garden soil as bedding for the worms. They can't digest that. And don't mix fresh manure into the bedding. These will heat up the bedding too hot and literally cook your worms. If you've had your worm bin for a while, you may notice some other creatures in your worm bin, like springtails, sow bugs, pill bugs, and millipedes. And these are okay to have in there. If you have some that like fruit flies and that sort of thing, try to use non-pesticide methods of control, such as swatting them, putting in traps for fruit flies and ants and that sort of thing. And rodents are usually not a problem if the bin is constructed and managed properly. So if you have any questions about this and you want to get into this, the book Worms Eat My Garbage is really a kind of an interesting book to take a look at. Also, another hint she has, if you're allergic to molds or mildew, you may want to keep it, the worm bin outside of your immediate living areas, because those are part of the composting process. So in summary, to environmentally manage our kitchen and yard waste, we can plan, buy, and use food wisely so we don't have as much waste. We can plan landscapes to reduce less waste by planting plants that are the correct size, planting plants that are suitable for the growing site so we don't end up pulling them up and throwing them away and buying a new one and throwing that one away, etc. Be creative in ways to use your yard waste on property. Are there some places you can stash some of those leaves from the fall until spring? Encourage others, your family and friends and stuff, to be mindful of the choices they make. Look into possibly composting with worms if you have that opportunity, and just be an example of good environmental stewardship whenever we can. And if people ask you why you're doing some of these things, go ahead and explain to them why. At the end of my talks, I always have some information for people. If you're researching a question that you have about gardening, enter your question or topic in the search box on your search engine on your computer, and then add the word extension after it. This will bring up information to the top of the results list from university extension sites, and it'll often be like a university or college name abbreviated, and then an edu after it. So that's where you know that those are extension sites. And then choose a state that's near our state or has a similar zone and climate as our state. For example, if you're watching this in Wisconsin, you might be able to pick up some articles from Minnesota, Michigan, Iowa, Illinois, Pennsylvania, New York, because those places have generally the same kind of growing conditions. And when you do this, you know that you're getting tested and proven information. You're not getting someone's blog on the computer who tried some weird thing and it worked for them one time, so now they're telling everybody to use this, and it's not anything that's going to help most people. So that's how master gardeners if we don't know the answers to questions, and we don't know the answers to everything that people ask us, this is where we go. And we try to find information this way. And if you still can't find anything that you want, then it's time to, contact a master gardener or your local county extension office, and they can help you out too. Lastly, I usually try to include one or two invasive species that are particularly noticeable at this time of the year. One of them is Japanese barberry, and you may be familiar with this as a landscape plant because it was promoted as a landscape plant for a long time. But we also found that it gets away from cultivation and ends up, as a picture you can see in the upper right-hand corner, it ends up establishing these big areas of very thick plants, and none of the natural plants that would grow in that conditions can grow there anymore. And so therefore the insects and the birds and the mammals and things that depend on those native plants can't live there anymore either. So most people are probably familiar with this. It's a shrub that can get 2 to 6 feet high. It had the green leaves in the summer, like the picture there. If you look carefully at a branch, it has one spike picker at each node on the branch, and it has the red leaves in the fall with the red oval-shaped berries. And the other reason you don't want this around your house is these are tick heavens or havens for wood ticks and other ticks. So they just really like where the area where these are growing. So, and this spreads by rootings and by seeds. So if you have it in your landscape, it might be a good time to get rid of it. It was used as a landscape plant, kind of often for hedges and things like that, as a natural plant thing to keep intruders out. But it's been recognized now that it can be invasive. Another one that we see often at this time of the year, and we don't notice it until now, is the burning bush. And again, it was brought into our country as a landscape plant. And you can see on the top up there, it can make a very thick stand when it gets away into the natural environment. It can get up to 15 feet high. It has inconspicuous little spring flowers and some red fruits in the fall. And again, it just overtakes the understory of wooded areas. The stems, if you can see in the bottom picture, have these flattened segmented wings on them, which is one way to distinguish it from many other plants, because it's one of the few plants that have that. And sometimes people may confuse this with sumac from a distance, but if you look at the stems, you'll see that difference. Sumac usually goes kind of from green to yellow to an orangey red, whereas the burning bush is more of an intense true red. And this spreads by seeds. I've found that I took out several of those along a trail that I walk on every day. And I don't know where the nearest plant was, but there were a half dozen of them within 3 blocks just growing in the woods. So it too was it was brought here as a landscape plant for its brilliant red fall color, but there are other plants we can use that also have brilliant red fall color too and are not as invasive. So with that, we'll go to questions, and I'm going to stop sharing so that I can see the questions if we have any here. And let me get out of here. And oops, wrong screen. What am I doing here? Do we have any chat questions?
Not so far, Donna. We had one earlier about having the PowerPoint available, so I shared that link again in the chat. But
okay.
Otherwise, yeah, we don't have many questions tonight. So you guys, remember, you can ask ask anything and Donna will try to answer or try to find the answer for you. Or any questions that you have about composting or the invasive species that she shared too. Please go ahead and type those questions in the question and answer section.
Another thing is, if you have other topics that you would like to have programs presented about, or you're wondering about, type those in there too, because we're always looking for ideas for programs to present. Anybody?
We do have one in the chat. It says, I may have missed it. However, how long to get all materials to break down in a compost?
Good question. It depends how hard you want to work at it. If you turn it regularly, and regularly means like every 2 weeks, maybe, you could have, you could start your compost pile now in the fall, with all the materials, you know, that are dying and all this stuff that you're putting in there. And then next year, by turning it every week or two, you would have compost by the end of the summer for sure. If you just do a lazy cold compost, the lazy method, it may take as long as 2 years for that material to really build, break down and be ready to be used as compost. That answered the question. And we got
There is. Are there any local laws about a compost in our area?
Not that I know of. I don't know where your area is, if you're talking about Marshfield, or I mean, I have people sometimes coming in from different states on these programs. So as far as I know, I don't think so. I've had mine and it's out in the open. If somebody didn't like it by now, I'm sure I would have heard about it.
The person who asked about how long it takes for compost to break down, she said usually by spring she has some dirt, and she has the black bins.
It could. It all depends how, you know, if the materials you put in there were small, that might be we're able to work. I know mine, I'm working on trying to put smaller pieces in there. Sometimes I don't, but it takes longer the bigger the pieces too.
All right, we have another question in the question and answer section. The question is, I have seen vertical tower composters used before. Would this be a cold compost?
Vertical tower. I mean, it's just a tall tower.
I'm not sure. And she also says, like, also, can you say anything about the bokashi bins, please? I hope I pronounced that right. Bokashi bins.
I have not heard of that. I don't know what they are. I have to make a note and take a look at that. Bokashi bins. I haven't heard about that.
Oh, and they have a question. Should she continue composting during the winter?
During the winter, the compost pile will probably freeze. over the course of the winter. I have to wait for mine in spring to thaw out before I can start taking the compost out. You can start one anytime, and it will start working again in the spring when it warms up. So it doesn't continue to compost all winter.
All right, then there's another question of, can whole tomatoes be composted or will the seeds grow?
They can be composted. You might get some volunteer tomato plants the following year. And again, I would just take those and throw those back in your bin again to be recycled. The thing with tomatoes, that's one of the plants that are susceptible to late blight. And if your tomato plants were diseased, I wouldn't throw them in the compost pile. If you had late blight. And you would probably know that because your plants would have died like within a week or less this summer. If it's just a plain tomato, yeah, you can put them in there. You don't necessarily, they're very moist. They're going to break down really quick. But you may have some seeds that survive the composting process. So I wouldn't be surprised if you have a volunteer tomato coming up here or there.
Is there any other questions out there, guys?
Or any suggestions for future programs?
Yes, especially that if anybody has something else relating to gardening or, you know, outside care of plants or things like that, we're always looking for new ideas because we definitely want to do programs that are of interest. Oh, we do have another question. How do you dispose of diseased plants?
Okay, those plants, if it's some of those really nasty diseased plants we have, I talked about earlier, those should be bagged in garbage bags and put out for the trash. But again, you want to try and eliminate the amount of disease you have by being a good gardener. And if you have a hot compost pile, if you tend it so it's a hot compost pile, most of the diseases, except for those that I listed on that one slide, will be taken care of in your compost pile. If you have a cold compost pile, they may hang around for a little longer.
Anybody have anything else? I'll give you a couple, we'll give like 30 seconds left for anybody typing just in case. Otherwise, I did a search in our library catalog just by typing in the word composting, and I was surprised with how many books we actually had here in Marshfield on the shelf about composting. And that's the only thing the whole book is about. So I was excited that there are a lot of different ways that you can do it, and it doesn't seem that hard. And I mean, any house that uses any kind of fruits or vegetables can compost. So yeah, there's lots of resources out there, and I know Donna has a huge list of resources too that's in that Google file that's, you know, it's been shared a couple times tonight. That, you know, if you want more information, definitely don't hesitate to look for more information too.
All you have to do is ask.
Yep. All right. Does anybody have any recommendations for other programs? No? Okay.
Well, I'm gonna have to put on my thinking cap then. Looks like
Yep.
this was a good one. We had 18. That was good.
Yeah, yeah. At most we had 23. So
Oh, okay.
that's a very good show. So thank you guys very much. Next month we're doing what, Donna? I think that will be a good one too.
We're talking about, I think the title is something like jumping worms, Japanese beetles, and something else. Oh my. We're going to be talking about those invasive things that we get tons of questions every summer about these particular, lily leaf beetles was the other one.
Yes.
About these particular invasive insects. We have all kinds of invasive things that are coming into our country, causing lots of problems, but we'll talk about those and maybe about some things about invasives altogether, as a total thing, why they're a problem and what we can try and do about them.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm really, really interested to see, because I live in Vesper and we had lily beetles really bad this year, where it was just sticks out of the ground. I was surprised that they even eat the green on the stems. There is nothing left.
Yeah.
When those come out. And that was the first year I've ever seen them. So
yeah,
they are here. And it's scary. So, all right. Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Donna, for sharing your knowledge with us again. And thanks for everybody for watching tonight. And the link for this program will be on YouTube, so you can even watch it again. Just thank you so much, Donna, for always being willing to share with us your knowledge.
Okay. Anytime.
All right. Thanks,
Good night.
everyone. Bye.